Right, hello, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be having a look at some landscape materials. Big thanks to Daniel Q for supporting me on Patreon and asking this question about landscape materials. It's actually going to be the first of a small series I'm going to do covering all the different parts about landscapes, starting with the basics today and then moving on to sort of more advanced things over the next few weeks. I have here a quick scene with some landscapes set up, but I'm just going to go over the process of creating a landscape and then adding some things to that. So let's just start with a new scene. Let's do it like that. Start with the default level. Give it a second. Just delete the cube, and we're going to start by creating a landscape. So I'm not going to go too much into all of the settings here. Video present. Yep, fine. I'm not going to go too much into all the settings here. There's a lot about sculpting and things like that. We're going to focus more on the material side with this video at least. But here we've got sections for sizes. How big a landscape are we going to make? I'm going to keep mine really small. How many sections to have in each component. So that's how many of the different kind of like breaking down. We're looking at how that how the engine kind of like compartmentalizes and culls things, and we can just go really quite small and make a kind of little mini landscape. And there we are. You will maybe notice these hard lines. So when it comes in, the shading hasn't been baked, and you quite often get sort of shadow errors on that, so we can just ignore those for now. If we do a quick build, it shouldn't take long with no things in the scene. And that'll just kind of get rid of those shading errors. So just, you might notice them, wonder why they're there. Well, it's just a quick shadow thing. And if there we go, with a quick bake, they go away completely. So similarly, you could just go in and turn off cast shadows. Usually, landscape's not going to need any shadows if it's nice and flat. If it's got big hills, obviously then it does. Depends on your scene. So obviously we can go in and sculpt our landscape. So I can just go in here, add a bit of height to this thing. Obviously I'm getting my shadow errors back. Make this a bit bigger. Oh, maybe a bit too high. Maybe we can go in and sculpt our landscape, no problem. Like I say, not going to go too much into all this. I'm sure there's a lot of information available, and you can just kind of like play around with the sort of that side of it. So what we do want to do though is create a landscape material. So I'm just going to create a new one. Landscape test, and here we have a slot for landscape material, simple as. And I will note we can apply any landscape or any materials to a landscape. There's no problem. If I just go in here and find, let's say, I don't know, concrete poured, we can just use that, and it will apply once it compiles to anything, any material will apply as a landscape material, no problem. But not really getting the advantages of the landscape system. So going back to our landscape materials, landscape test. There we are. Simplest thing we're going to use is the landscape layer blend. So this is the node that sort of takes the different layer inputs and gives us different outputs. So just going to do a quick test here with two different landscapes. Let's say, well, yeah, no, let's go on with this. So we'll start with, say, concrete, and then we'll have also, I don't know, grass, something like that. And the first thing that kind of comes up as a query, don't really understand what's going on here. This is the different layer blends, weight, alpha, and height, and that's really what we're going to be covering today. So for now, I'm just going to leave it as weight, which is the default. Stick in my two textures. Let's see, concrete panels, that'll do. And then here, let's have a grass texture. And plug that in to our base color. Now, Unreal is notorious for high compile times, and landscape definitely you do get some quite high compile times. So apologise if there's any pauses in the video where that's going to be an issue. Hopefully I've got things pre-compiled and it shouldn't take too long. But so I've set my material up, got a layer blend with two input layers, and then it's assigned to my material, to my landscape. I'm not seeing anything. Well, it's definitely assigned. That's because we haven't set up our layer info. So if I go in here to paint on my on my landscape. Nothing comes up. Now this is a bug that I found doing this. The right material is assigned, the right material is compiled, but because we assigned it, then we added the landscape and then compiled it, Unreal hasn't picked up which layers it should have in it. So if I just go in back to the placement mode, select this, reassign the same layer or the same material, and now it's picked up the two layers that exist within that material. So little bug there. Not sure that's happening in all versions. I'm on 4.24 at the moment, but quite an easy fix. Just reassign it. Anything like that that kind of gets lost, just reassign stuff, and it should pick up correctly. So still not seeing anything. Why not? Well, in here on our concrete layer, we've got no layer info. So here we can create weight blended or non-weight blended, and that kind of ties back into these weight blend, alpha blend, etc. So for this, for the default, I'm going to create here a weight blended layer, stick it in the right place, click in my landscape. It's picked up the name, concrete layer info, and I'll do another one for the grass. Grass one actually exists. Obviously I have things named grass already, but I'm just going to create a new one. Right, okay, so it seems to be a little bit of a problem in that compiling shaders is destroying the video capture, so apologies for that. Not a huge amount I can do, unfortunately. Hopefully it shouldn't be too bad in terms of compiling. Audio still seems to be there, so hopefully you can still hear what's happening even if the video is getting a little bit stuttery and pausing. But yes, moving on. Here we are. We have our basic landscape set up. So we have obviously the ability to click on the grass and paint grass, click on the concrete, paint back on the concrete, and that's the sort of the initial first pass setup. So just want to go over a few things with this setup. Firstly, these layer info nodes. What are they doing? Well, if you saw last week's video about vertex painting, you know that when we vertex paint onto a model, we're storing that data in the vertices and the vertex colors, and then we were reading that back. Here we're not painting on vertex colors, we're painting on the layer info instead. So this actually stores which of the vertices have been painted, the various sort of colors that is then read back in the material. So this is why we need a layer info setting in here to control how that is controlled. So if we open it up, there's a couple of other things in here that's quite useful. Firstly, it's where we can set physical material. So one of the limitations of the vertex painting system that we did last week, if you paint wood on top of stone and then you shoot it with the pistol, what kind of response should you get? Well, obviously if you get like a particle effect or a sound, that won't necessarily pick up the right material type, because it can only be set per material, and a vertex painted material obviously has two material types visually. So here we can put the grass, create a physical material. I don't have any in here, but we could create a physical material here, set up for grass, and that would work for sort of our sounds and our particle effects. Similarly, we can control the hardness. It doesn't seem like it's live, and then we can tell it whether or not to use weight blending or not, and we'll get on to what blending modes are and what they do in a minute. So the important one here is physical material, so you can set your sort of sound systems and particle systems up correctly. So just sticking with this material, no, actually let's not stick with this one, let's go back to the other level and my already compiled ones. Let's not save anything for now. So here we are, very much similar setup on this landscape. I'm using a layer blend node, and I've used 3 different textures here instead. So I've got a mud, a stone, and a grass. Now I'm using this landscape coordinates node. So obviously when we do anything with a texture, we have to apply some UVs to it to control how tiling and things works. From my little experiments and my understanding, there's very little difference between how the landscape coordinates work and just using a normal text chord. It does have this inbuilt mapping scale, this multiplier, and there's a couple other little features which we'll get to in a future video, I think. So, but for now, we can just plug our landscape coordinates in. We're using a landscape. They've obviously got a node that says landscape chords. Makes sense to use it, I think, and it gives us this mapping scale. Doesn't give us a dynamic way of doing it, and again we'll cover that again a bit later. So for now, 3 different textures plugged into our layer blend, and then we're applied that to our material. Now what's different here is we've actually set this to use the alpha blend. I think this is probably the easiest one to understand, so we'll start with that. So again, the choices were alpha, weight and height. Default was weight, but if we change them all to alpha, we get this kind of result. So let's just have a look at what's happening here. So in the landscape, we've got our 3 different layer info nodes, and when I created them, if I just find it and open it, one of the choices is to use weight blended or not, and I chose no, not to, and it just sets this this boolean to be true, so we're not using a weight blend on this layer info. So what do we do with this? Well, if I click mud, if I click lump grass and paint grass, that makes sense, that works. If I click stone and try and paint stone, you can see I'm kind of painting underneath the grass. So what's actually happening here is all of these layers, a bit like a Photoshop stack, they're all being multiplied by their own layer info. So the layer info contains a sort of black and white mask that's been painted into the vertex sort of information of the landscape. So I paint all the grass away, then I paint all the stone away. Just holding shift and clicking to sort of subtract, you can see I got complete mud, fine, and I can paint stone on top, and I can paint grass on top. But here it's height dependent, so it's order dependent, so I can't now paint my stone back on top of my grass. What I've actually done is underneath here I have painted stone, and if you kind of erase it away again, you can see. So it's kind of completely height dependent. Each layer is being multiplied by a mask. That's what we're painting, and then they're sort of stacked on top of each other, a bit like a kind of overlay, sort of a Photoshop. So the top layer is visible, and the second layer is only visible where the top layer isn't. Which hopefully makes sense. Quite useful, quite powerful. Depending on what kind of landscape you're painting, you might want to build up a system this way. Something like mud at the bottom, stone, grass on top. That seems to work, but there are some limitations to this. It doesn't have any kind of nice blending between things. We'll get on to height blending in a minute. So that's sort of one of the options we have available to us. So using the alpha, each layer is independent, but there's a kind of layer order importance, and that layer order comes just from the order in the material here. So mud is the lowest layer, then stone, and then grass on top. Yeah, so that's alpha blending. So what are the other options? Well, we have weight blending. Actually, little tip before we move on with that. So here, nice simple alpha blend example. We've just used diffuse color or base color. If we wanted to sort of add a bit more interest to this, add some normal maps, for example. If I go into the right folder, I have here alpha normal. If I apply that, hopefully without compiling and stuttering the video. Oh, I've got a few compiles. Unfortunately, like I say, shader compiling's pretty ubiquitous in Unreal, and unfortunately does not play very well with video capture. So I will just give it another second. Hopefully this will come back and start updating. Yep. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Sorry about that. Maybe I'll cut these out in the edit. So here we are. Yes, I've added normal maps. So how have I done this? I mean, obviously we can see we're getting a bit more of a surface information here. Still not actually height blending, but we're definitely getting a more realistic sort of response from our stone. So we could go in and do this, add another sort of set of textures, blend them again, but this information here in these layer blends kind of needs to be exactly the same for both. Obviously the more kind of like components you add, if you added another one for roughness, another one for, let's say, emissive or ambient occlusion, you're going to have quite a messy material, quite a lot of information going on. So as always, there's probably a better way to do this, and that's to use material attributes. So we have this function here, make material attributes. I've covered this a few times on the channel, but if we change our input here, use material attributes, to use material attributes instead, these layer blend nodes, they accept material attributes just the same as they do anything else. So we could do all of our kind of build up our materials individually first, then turn them into material attributes, and then blend them together into one output. And that's exactly what I'm going to do in the next example. So close that down. So again, alpha is sort of layers, everything's independently multiplied and then sort of stacked on top of each other. And the alternative is what's called weight blending. So here, if I open up this material, I've done exactly what I said. So I've got my mud texture or mud material built as material, then my stone, and then my grass, and then I've just turned them into material attributes and blended them. So here, using weight blends, what does a weight blend do? Well, it's kind of a similar sort of, or a different approach to the same thing. What happens with a weight blend is the total blends, or the total value of all the blends, always adds up to 1. So if it's, say, 50% mud, 25% stone, 25% grass on a particular area, and then we wanted to paint more mud, the value of the mud goes up, but the other values go down, and so there's always a sort of total amount of 1 left at the end. And this has both advantages and disadvantages. So if we go back into our painting, here I can always click on the thing I want to paint and paint on top, and it doesn't matter because those values that I'm painting are becoming higher and higher, and then secretly underneath the other values are disappearing. So we get full control. Just paint what you want, where you want. This is the default. It's probably the easiest to sort of work with and understand. But if I try to erase the mud, well, if there's anything left underneath, it's going to come back. But here, let's say I paint 100%. Let's try this way. 100% grass all the way here. Hopefully this is all 100%. If I then try and erase it, it doesn't really work. And you can see here in these corners, I just have a little bit of mud left. So if you paint 100% and then try and erase it, you can't. So it's a completely different way of working, but whichever one kind of makes sense. Like I say, Unreal's default is to use weight blending, and that works fine. It is very sort of does what it says on the tin. You take the layer, you click and you paint, and that's probably what you want to be doing most of the time. If you do want this kind of height-based kind of logic where one layer sits on top of another one, it's pretty realistic for sort of terrain. Usually you're going to have a kind of a base mud layer and then maybe stones and sand or whatever on top, and there is going to be a height sort of component to that, or a layering component to that, I should maybe say. But yeah, either one is a sort of totally valid choice. The only difference being here with these layer info, when I created these, it turned the weight blend off. So there's an option there in the creation for weight blended or not weight blended. So that's weight blended and alpha. The last one, and probably the one that you're going to actually be using most of the time, is height blending. So if we open this up, in our blend mode, our blend node here, same setup with the materials, just putting them into material attributes. We have, if we select height blend, we actually get a height option. And if I go back to alpha, get rid of that height, change it back to height. There it is. So this is looking for a height input. And what this is going to do is when it's comparing the two things, so this still works like a weight blending. So if we go in, let's close that, to our landscape and paint, does the same thing of selecting stone, paint stone, but we don't have that sort of deleting functionality or that sort of height logic to things. But what it does do, if we zoom in a little, it takes into account a height map. So if I go back to my material and have a look in the alpha of my diffuse, here we have a height map. So we have black, obviously the lower ground level, and then the white with a little bit of noise, giving it a bit of height information. And then if we have a look at our terrain, you can see the grass is kind of painting into the sort of the cracks and the crevices. It's still not perfect. It's not the easiest thing to be able to sort of paint. We are still limited by the resolution of the landscape, so we can't go in. It's not a per pixel result. We can't quite go in and get full control over this, I find. It definitely has an effect, and we kind of get that sort of result. Sand is going to work a lot better. Obviously, things that could be a thin layer on top of the stone is going to work. Obviously, grass, can't really have grass coming through like this. So if you did want this sort of effect, maybe you'd make a cobblestones with sand underneath and then a cobblestones with grass underneath, and we'll have a look in future videos how we can kind of make some more advanced landscape layers and blend that in that way. But just to show the effect, here we've got the landscape height. This is the height blend, and if we swap it for the weight blend, all that painting information, like I say, it's all stored in the layer info node. So if we just swap this over, and it will just give you the exact same kind of painting. But here, see here we don't have any of that height map having an effect. And then we check in the height, and we do. So it's definitely is a better result. Maybe not good enough yet, but we'll have a look in future episodes, future videos, how we do that. One little caveat with using height blend. If we open this up, so if everything is set to use a height, as it is here, you might get problems. If we just go to the documentation, you can see here in this example, if everything's set to be height, at some point you might be able to get 0 information. Everything's set to 0, it's all going to blend together, and you can get black, which is not really what you want as a result. So what it's just to do is always have at least one of your layers set to alpha blend, and that's going to be kind of like your fallback. And that way, no matter what you do, if all the heights are set to 0, then what you'll get is your fallback material, which will be in this case the soil. Probably in this case would make sense to be the mud, so I've just changed that to alpha blend. And then that's kind of like a base layer underneath, and then some painted layers on top, which are using height maps, so gives you a nice result between them. So not going to compile that for now, but that would be a sort of safer result. We weren't getting any little black squares, it wasn't ever painted to 0, but safe, better safe than sorry, easy to do. The other big gotcha, and watch it with these examples, is, oh, that one's not painted on at all. I obviously didn't save it. Yes, okay. It's very easy. If we go in here, I've taken my landscape material, everything was working fine, and I've just added more and more layers, more and more complexity. Nice, no problem. This is going to compile in a minute and break everything, unfortunately, but there we go. So I've just added some weird sci-fi hexes and some bits of wood, whatever materials I had lying around. And then if I go in here and actually add some of these layers to my material, so again, this is using height map, weight blending. At some point, I am back. So here we have the error that I was trying to achieve a minute ago. Looks like shaders are still compiling. Well, they're not. I can see that there's no overlay, no little message up here, and also my video capture is working, which means that there's no shaders compiling in the background. And we're getting some failure to compile here. That's where we're getting this default sort of grey fallback texture. So what's happening? Well, if we open up the material, it says here down in our stats, texture sample is 2 of 16. Well, we can have a look at all these textures. There's probably a lot more than 2. Basically, the compiler stats here doesn't understand this layer blend. So what the actual thing that's happening under the hood is, when you paint a layer on a section, it compiles a new shader with that layer included. So we've got here in our material, say 7 layers, is it? 5? 6 layers, but it doesn't put all 6 layers on all sections of the material. It doesn't need to, it would be wasteful. So it allows you to do this in the material sort of editor, like to make this, but actually if you try and put all 6 on at once, what happens is you go over the number of samplers, which isn't really any good, because basically it's a limitation of the shading model. It's not specific to Unreal. This is a limitation of all graphics hardware. You can't load more than 16 textures into memory at once, because it doesn't work. It doesn't have the capacity to do that. Maybe in the future it will, but how do we get around this? What's the solution? Well, one, you could just paint less material and variety in each section. That would probably be the most performant way to limit this down, but if you do have this problem and you do want to get around it, if you select your textures like this, why am I selecting one that doesn't have, not just selecting, there we go. There we go, so if I just select the textures, and list the textures on their own, we have this option here, sampler source. So at the moment what's happening is it's trying to load all 16 textures into memory, or the more than 16 textures into memory, can't do it, and it even says here in the tooltip, this allows materials to use more than 16 unique textures on SM5 platforms. So basically if we change this to shared wrap, what will happen is when this is all compiled, and I won't compile for now, because it's going to break everything. Once it's all compiled, what it's going to try and do is take those textures and atlas them into one big texture, and then just load that one big texture, and then it reads the bits that it needs when it needs them. So more expensive, you don't want to be using this unless you have to, but it does allow you to have all of these textures loaded as once. So that now, if I compile, and then maybe pause the video, let it compile, will give us Mate, good to be back. Yes, this is now compiled. I've changed these to be a shared source, and if I then go to my terrain, we can see that error has fixed itself. It is more expensive than it was. Those textures are now being atlased and then read back. But like I say, if it's causing you problems, there is a solution or a fix for that. Pretty common error to run into, not super well explained anywhere in the documentation. So I think that's probably enough for this first introductory video. We've gone over how to sort of set up a quick landscape material, how to use material attributes. Really powerful feature. Definitely want to be using those in our materials, make things easier and sort of more. There's no difference in functionality, it's just easier to work with, and so that makes everything a lot easier. And then the difference between alpha blending and weight blending. Remember, alpha blending, each layer has its own sort of multiplier, and then the layers are sort of stacked top to bottom to top. So that's what you end up seeing. Weight blending, each of the layers is sort of painted but has an effect on the other, but maybe a bit more easier to work with. Just click and paint what you want. And then obviously height blending as well, which is same as weight blending but also takes into account a height map. Cool. So yes, that's enough for 1 week, I think. Hopefully haven't been too disrupted by the compile errors. I'll try and cut as much out of it, pauses out as possible in the edit. But yeah, this will be the first of a few videos on landscapes. I think there's quite a lot more interesting things we can do with landscapes, and we'll cover those in the next few weeks. So thanks again to the Patreon supporters, especially Daniel Q, for asking this question. And as always, if you do have any questions, comments, or you want to support me on Patreon, please do so, and I will see you all next time.